constantly have that problem.
Because I'm in the corner, so I'm in the wrong spot, and I can't move me. Sorry.
The ever wonderful Emily Oak, welcome to the podcast.
Hi there.
It is so fucking great to have you, lady.
Yay! Happy Thursday. Well, Thursday for me, Wednesday.
Well,
for you.
happy hump day from me.
Hello from the future.
Yeah, it still fucks with my head constantly, that whole thing.
It's the ongoing joke.
Oh yeah, and especially the flying back and arriving back in California 15 minutes before you left Australia.
Yeah. It's how Matt Perger and I became friends, actually. We were going to, where were we going? To the TED conference years ago. And because we were flying together, I'd booked the tickets, but I got the time zones wrong. So I booked us 2 days ahead. Oh, no. So then we took an impromptu trip up to Vancouver, which was great. And thus we bonded as friends. So I thank the time zone for us being really good mates. I rang him and I said, mate, I'm really sorry. I appeared to have booked us 3 days too early to get to LA. Do you want to go on a little holiday?
Yes. Shout out to Matt. He's such a lovely guy.
Yeah,
he and I solidified our lifelong friendship. He said, when I was in Melbourne, I asked him, how many cities is that now that we keep meeting up in? He said, the rule is that once you've met someone in 3 cities, you're lifelong friends. So we're stuck with each other. I'm like, yeah, that works for me, dude.
Oh, cool. I've never tried that rule, but I will apply it.
Yes. So you have held a very special place in my heart as a colleague and as a friend, because of something that happened to me a few years ago. And that thing was this elixir. Cheers, by the way.
Oh, cheers. Morning coffee.
So you were at the very first secret elixir rainbow tasting that happened with all like the gods of coffee in Sydney. You were obviously one of them. You were sitting actually right next to Nick Griffith and I.
I remember.
And just saying, I put you there because you're one of my safe people.
Oh, thanks.
It was a very nerve-wracking time for me because, you know, we were presenting a world first product to the most influential people in the coffee industry and people who I considered friends and really wanted to hear what they thought of it. And it was such a great event, and the dinner afterwards was so much fun, and it was such a wonderful night and had a great time, whatnot. But the things that came in the following couple of years after that were pretty hard for me.
Mm.
And you watched a lot of it unfold, and you were the one person who I kept seeing on Twitter and on Facebook and on Instagram that if somebody said to you, what do you think of it? Or you saw somebody comment really harshly to you, you would go back and say, look, it might not be for me, but I can see that this would work for some people. Mm. And that really meant a lot to me, to have an ally in somebody who was at least going out there and saying, this isn't for everybody, but it is for some people. And I want to first publicly thank you a lot.
Oh, thanks, Lee.
It meant everything to me, and it was a lot of the time some of the saving grace for my mental health at the time, as you can imagine. And look, I've grown a lot since then and become very grateful for the role that Elixir played in me growing up as a business owner, you know, and hopefully someone who can represent for the future leads in our industry. But I think you really started helping people get their head around this idea that nothing is for everybody in our industry. And I think if there's anything that I think that you represent, and you are a huge figure in the Australian coffee industry. Oh. And
you're going to make me blush, and we haven't even started yet.
Well, I'm allowed. I'm your friend.
Fair enough.
But you are somebody who, you know, you and I talk about the fact that we're both these kinds of women that just speak our minds. We are assertive and we just say things the way that they are. And you probably do that a little softer than I do.
Not always. Not that you're harder than me, but, you know.
But you are definitely somebody who a lot of people, not just women, but a lot of people look up to in the industry. And I'm super proud that you're my friend, and I'm super proud of what you've achieved. And I think we're very lucky to have you. So
I don't really know what to say to all of that. That's very kind.
You're very welcome. But I want to let me start it off with a question then. How do you go about how do you go about talking to people about their coffee when you walk into a cafe? We posed this as a question in our question of the day on Instagram. How do you give people feedback about coffee? And it was really interesting, the number of people that say, I wait to be asked. Do you wait to be asked?
Look, I do. Most of the time I wait to be asked. And I guess there's two ways that I would necessarily approach this. So if I'm walking into a cafe where I know the barista or the owner or bless you.
Bless you. Was that Oscar?
Sitting on the couch.
Yay.
If I walk into a cafe and I know the person, a lot of the time I'm very lucky, and I know, not that I'm comparing myself, James Hoffman has this problem with walking into a cafe and people, being really excited to share their coffee, which is fantastic. There's two ways I look at it, and I guess a lot of it comes from my experience in the industry, and I haven't necessarily followed a career path that a lot of especially coffee people have. I've worked for larger companies. I've worked for myself. I've worked for franchise organizations. And so as part of that learning process, I got to a point where you would get, like, I guess you with Elixir, you get a lot of opinions about people. You have a lot of things to say about you and your product, and a lot of the time haven't even tried the product. It's just an opinion based on an observation or a judgment about something they don't always necessarily understand. So yes, I will wait to be invited. A lot of the time I'm just going in because I want to have a nice cup of coffee and some breakfast and do some work or something. And I really enjoy particularly visiting cafes that don't necessarily serve my products. I'm really interested to see how other people want to serve their products. So in that instance, if people do ask for feedback, they'll often say, what kind of coffee would you like? I pretty much drink everything on the menu. I'm not huge on alternative milks, but I'll try them for the sake of understanding how products taste with them. I'm pretty open to all that kind of stuff. And if people ask me, well, what do you think of the coffee? I'm maybe a bit difficult in responding, and I say to them, well, what were you trying to present with it? So to me, it's more about understanding what a barista or a cafe or a space is trying to present with their product and what kind of experience they're trying to give to their customers, and really comparing it to that if necessarily, to make sure they delivered on it. So they're going to come to me with a list of descriptors and a really comprehensive menu with a lot of flavor profiles. I will do a comparison. I'm not going to not do that. But a lot of the time it'll be, about that. And I think recently in particular, because I'm based in Sydney, we're a little bit behind Melbourne in Australia in having a really diverse range of spaces that offer really comprehensive, I'm not going to say high-end, but complicated or elitist or whatever coffee bars where they do have really comprehensive menus and 10 or 15 coffees and a whole range of brewing products. They really need to be able to cater to the full gamut of people. So that's a bit of a complicated way of saying, depending on what they're trying to offer, the only feedback I will really give is whether it's in comparison to what they're trying to present back to their customers.
What do you think? Yeah, it does. What do you think of this offering of, $18 coffees and, for a cup of coffee and this extensive menu? I want to specify before I say that I wasn't dissing the cup of coffee that we both know we're talking about. This is the Honor offering. I actually went there and was given that coffee, and it was fucking amazing. It was easily the best filter I had before I left Australia, and they also served me the best flat white that I'd had in probably 10 years.
Nice.
Yeah. So what do you think of these extensive menus in relation to the fact that most people come in and drink cappuccinos with 2 sugars?
Again, probably related to my last response, and Australia's a really interesting market too. And a lot of the time when I have conversations with people about this, really clear, it's really important to understand that the Australian market is not like any other market in the world.
No, it really isn't.
Perhaps New Zealand, but we are 100% espresso. There are sprinklings of filter coffee, alternative brew methods and everything else. But if you did it statistically, they don't even represent 0.5, 0.5% of them. We are all espresso-based menu. So having said that, I think our market is quite well educated in the coffee menu, the traditional menu, the cappuccinos, the flat whites, the long blacks or Americanos and everything else. You can get coffee at 7-Eleven, you get espresso coffee. McCafe is an Australian invention that was launched in 1993. There are 950 stores. You go to McDonald's for a cappuccino and they charge something close to $5. So
it's outstanding. It's just a mind fuck.
It is, and it's an interesting market for a lot of people to get their head around. So I think there's a benchmark or there's a base level that is higher than perhaps other countries where espresso is still a relatively emerging market, or it's only been around for the last 20 years. So we've basically been established as an espresso drinking out of home, I should say. At home, we're still really big on instant coffee. Something like 65% of coffee at home is still instant. And I really only know because I did a lot of research for an article I wrote recently for Standard. So I've got all the stats are fresh in my brain. So there's a benchmark, I think, where people will walk into a space and, I think a lot of people get made fun of it. I love it when people come in and they create their own coffees. I want a 3/4 flat white with a double shot, or, I want something between a piccolo and a flat white, but not quite as small as a piccolo and large. I love all that stuff because it means that on some level we've managed to educate a customer base to a point where they're paying attention to their coffee and they know what they like. And I think that's a reflection of our industry, I guess, to a degree. I know we did go through that phase where we were sort of, high and mighty and saying you must drink filter and all this kind of stuff, and everyone went, yeah, no, it's not happening.
I make the big joke that over here when I'm helping consult to open a place or whatnot, and they're like, why aren't you guys big on filter in Australia? I'm like, we've tried, I promise. We would bring in filter. I remember at Harry's we would maybe sell 3 cups a day.
Yeah.
And we were making pots of filter and having to drink most of it ourselves.
Yeah. And look, we do the same too. I mean, even when we had the Sensory Lab in Bondi, we would probably sell a couple of litres a day, which is quite a lot. And that took a lot of conversation. Yeah. But I know there's a lot of people, people who are black coffee drinkers in general, well, let's try this filter and everything else. And there is, there's a little bit of sway, but it's still, I think you sort of got 50, 60 years of tradition.
Yeah.
Where your children are drinking a baby chino at the age of 2 or 3. There's a cultural aspect there where it's ingrained. But back to your question, I'm really good at
that's pretty much the way our conversations
I know it's how it goes. Look, I think there's definitely a place for it because I think at a greater level, and this is another thing that maybe we can touch on later on, people underestimate the value of a cup of coffee and what goes into it and the costs involved. And, you do get your $1 coffee at 7-Eleven or whatever it is. And then, your $3, $4, $5 coffee, cappuccino or whatever. And people sort of compare them and go, why am I paying this much for this and this much for this? If you can have an $18 or a $20 cup of coffee and you do have that experience, it's that old, thing where people go, well, they're quite happy to pay $12, $15, $20, $25 for a glass of wine or a single cocktail. There's a value chain in that. So I think if we can get people to understand the value of a cup of coffee, then it's going to be a positive experience. I think a lot of the time is when they do pay even, $10, $12, $15 and the coffee doesn't deliver an experience that, equates to that value, then people go, well, I paid $18 for a cup of coffee and it wasn't great. So having said all of that, I think if you're going to do that, in the current Australian market where, to be honest with you, we pay really good wages, rents are incredibly high, we've got a government arguing over the price of electricity bills and a whole bunch of other stuff, you've got to be able to get people through the door to buy your hundreds of cups of coffee a day to make a business viable, to keep your staff employed and keep the whole thing going. So you need to be able to relate to both of those ends of the market. So you need to have a really good cup of coffee, which, again, 80% of the Australians still drink a milk beverage of sorts, whether it's piccolo, flat white, latte, cappuccino.
With sugar in it, usually.
A lot less sugar and a lot less chocolate on cappuccinos that I've noticed in the last sort of 5 years. But, there is still some sugars.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I think if you want to run a viable business and you want to have that impact and be able to get people open to it and keep going, you've got to be able to cater to not everybody, because like you said, you're never going to make everybody happy, but you need to have a segment of the market that's going to make your business viable. So that's where I stand.
How did you get started in coffee? Because
completely
20
by
plus years,
accident.
right? Really?
1996 I started.
Wow.
Very old.
I'm older than you, so stop with the very old.
Okay, that's fine.
I'll never forget that conversation when you found out how old I was. You're like, that's not what I expected, Lee.
No, it's not. But most of the time, I lost the ability to decide on that.
That was so fun.
It's good.
It was a conversation we were having about boys, no doubt.
Oh, probably. Oh, actually, no, I remember.
You do remember that conversation.
We'll talk about
that's for another time. Anyway, so how did you get started?
I was at university and I started and completed a degree in government international relations and history.
Wow.
3 of the most exciting topics.
Right now, they're very exciting.
Oh, I loved it and still do love it. And I did work for a politician for a grand 3 months.
I just can't imagine you being around that.
Hence, it only lasted 3 months.
Yeah.
So working as a barista, it was one of those things. My sister, actually, I've got a younger sister, and she actually found me the job. She was fundraising for a friend of hers in our local area where we lived, who very unfortunately actually got a spinal injury playing rugby.
Oh, no.
It was pretty awful. So she was going shop to shop, just sort of looking for donations and prizes and stuff just to help with his rehab. And she walked into this shop, and the guy in there was a little bit under the pump. She got chatting. Turns out he had been a rugby player. Yep, no worries. Happy to donate, which was lovely. Donate some prizes. And he said to my sister, and she's very similar to me in character, do you need a job? I'm looking for a staff member. You're the right kind of person. And she was 16 at the time, so still at school.
Yes.
And she knew that I was looking for a job. And she said to him, oh, I'm still at school, but my sister needs a job.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, is she similar to you? And she said, yeah, pretty similar, just a different colour hair.
God, I love that.
It's pretty true. And, you know, he gave her his card. She brought it home, call this number, this guy needs a staff member. Having said that, 1996, it was a cell phone, and you paid by the minute. This is
yes,
so
I remember
for a lot of people. And when I say 1996, you know, I have staff members that were born after I finished high school, so it's still a little bit. It's one of those things. So I was sort of conscious. I rang this mobile number, and I was conscious of keeping the conversation short because the dollars were ticking over with he was trying to interview me on the phone. I'm like, this is going to cost me so much money. Anyway, it went well. Started the next day. Spent the first week cleaning. That was found out later on that was the test to make sure I was happy to dust all of the shelves. Mm-hmm. And what had happened to be was a sort of an espresso bar retail space in Sydney.
Okay.
And we had 18 single origins and 3 blends. It was quite interesting. I think it was
Say that again. 18
single origins and 3 blends, but there were hoppers along the back wall, so there was all hoppers in the back.
The days when we used to do that. Yeah.
The coffee was turned over twice a week, so the coffee was brought in fresh. Don't even remember what days, maybe Tuesday and Friday. So part of the job was cleaning, emptying the hoppers, cleaning up the perspex and everything, refilling them, doing the roast dates.
We used to do that at Toby's all the time.
I think it was probably, you know, a little bit of luck and everything else that. I mean, the guy's in Straddle. He was my first boss, who's formerly known as Will Forsyth. Just one of those people that had a little bit of foresight, had been to SCAA a few times, sort of got the gist. Anyway, this is, again, a very long, convoluted story. Started working there, and it was an espresso bar. We did single origin coffees as well. So a lot of that education was, for me, people would come in and buy their fresh coffee, and they would, you know, talk to me about that. And when I say it was Brazil and Nicaragua and Mexican Maracujá, and you know, it was fairly generic in terms of how they were, but we had that ability to try different coffees and understand the different origins and explain that to customers. And the bug bit me from there, from a customer service point of view, which is still an education, which was still, you know, the majority of what I've done with my career, but also just how interesting coffee actually was. and the rest is kind of history.
So from there, was your next big jump to air?
No. So from there, I worked on and off there whilst I studied. I actually did a gap year in the UK.
Okay.
And nothing to do with coffee when I was there in 1998. Lived there for a year and did some traveling and stuff. Came back to Australia, finished uni and still studied. Did my little stint working as I was a photocopy girl in a government office. It wasn't that exciting, but it was sort of going to change the world, and it was horrible.
Yeah, I can imagine.
I was naive and really, as you were out of university, decided to change the world, and the reality of it it broke my heart, to be honest.
Did you not feel that you could do more good working in a cafe and being of service to people's day? That was, I felt like I was changing the world.
That's what ended up happening. So then it's all a bit convoluted, to be honest with you, because there's all the part-time jobs you do when you do all that kind of stuff. I got a job offer from a company called Michelle's Patisserie in Australia, which at the time had just opened up their own roastery. And so there were 240 franchises when I joined the company, and they were transitioning the stores into having their own product. And so the job was basically training, franchise support, business development from the coffee point of view. And that's when I started to get involved with World Barista Championships, Cup of Excellence, all that kind of stuff, again, because they were quite at sort of, I guess, at the forefront of the industry in the time, and all those opportunities. They were the first company in Australia to ever auction, also buy on the Cup of Excellence auction in 2003.
Wow.
Bought the number 1 Guatemala, which today is still probably, one of those coffees that change your life when you drink that and you go, oh my gosh, I didn't know coffee could taste like that. I worked with them for about 4 years. Left there, bought a company from a friend of mine, which was an online coffee business, and transitioned that into a wholesale business. 2 weeks later, found out that I was pregnant, so that was fun. 2 weeks after I bought a business. But I think, was a blessing in disguise, because working for myself, and it was a relatively passive income because it was a distribution business, so getting coffee, consulting with people, and selling it as part of the product gave me a lot of spare time when Oscar was quite young. So, and then from there I went to air.
Yeah, air was, for me, I remember I was living in LA
where we
at
met.
the time. Yes, we met at air. I met you and Danielle at the same time. Lee Houghton was... I love your two friendship, you two's friendship. It's just so much fun, the way that you troll him on his birthday. It is fantastic. Go, if you don't know who we're talking about, go follow Yeezer and wait to his birthday and watch M Oak absolutely troll the fuck out of him with photos from his past.
If anybody has, the great urge to be one of those people that trolls back through. But having said that, it's funny because he has I think it's next year, he has a very significant birthday. It could be the year after. And so I'm saving up a lot of posts, and
fantastic.
I have had a chat with his wife about some additional photographs it may come to conclusion on his birthday. You never know.
That's going to be so much fun. I hang for them every year, the photos that you start posting of him. It's just so much fun. You are such a great troll at M Oak. It's wonderful.
But I don't troll many people, but he's absolutely.
But when you do,
return, so.
Yeah, he does. Yeah, he does. But he doesn't do it anywhere nearly as good as you do.
He just posts every job that's posted anywhere on Facebook. He basically tags me. He's trying to help me find work. So I'm really grateful.
Yeah, because you're doing so terribly at St. Ali. It's amazing.
You never know.
What were we saying? We were talking about air. Yeah. And so I came back from LA. I'd been living there and then came back. I don't know if it was for a holiday or moved back. And Lee said to me, I've got to take you to air. And I was so pumped because I was really looking forward to meeting you and Dan.
It's a long drive.
It was a long drive, but it was absolutely worth it because I had been living in LA and everyone had kept asking me, do you know M Oak? Do you know M Oak? Do you know M Oak? And I'm like, no, I don't know Emily Oak. And it was that great photo of you with your skateboard.
Do
Do you remember? Did you have a
No.
skateboard? A black and white photo of you I think you were wearing a singlet and jeans.
Yes. So that was Liz Clayton's photo.
Okay.
I had stayed with her. This is the fun part that I didn't mention before, is all the time through Michelle's Patisserie right through till air, I was working one way or another as a volunteer with the World Barista Championship. So that was, I think we'd had a board meeting in London just before 2010.
Yeah.
And then I think I got a round the world ticket just because. And I stopped in New York and stayed with Liz for a week after that. So she took that photo, and it was, I don't even know when it was, July or August in New York, and it was just 1,000,000 degrees. So we would hide inside during the day. And that skateboard belonged to Ian Tobin because he was staying there at the same time.
Wow.
Yeah.
Who was funding all these trips? Were you self-funding?
Meg, yeah.
Yeah, wow.
That's my donation to the industry.
Well, you were just everywhere, and everyone kept saying to me, do you know Em Oak? And I'm like, who is this coffee and woman that this woman in coffee that I've never met, that has been in the coffee industry like as long as I have? And her and I have never crossed paths, but because you were in, now I get it, you were in Michelle's and you were doing all of that stuff. And I was, look, I never got into coffee to have a long-term career in coffie. I got into coffee. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I got into coffee because it was going to be the thing that I was doing while I was getting my music career started. But as long as I was going to be in the coffee industry, I was going to do it as damn fucking good as I could. But it was only one foot in coffee, and everything else was in the music industry. And I thought, well, like eventually I'm going to meet Em Oak. So the chance that I got when I got back to Australia, I said to Lee, I want to meet Emily Oak. This person who everybody talks about, it feels rude that she's from the same city as I am and I don't even know her.
Parts of the world, like it's not like.
Yeah. And so it was just so great. It was to see you and Dan and the whole team. Was Toby Wilson there as well?
He was a regular guest. So it's interesting. Toby's an interesting guy because he's just helped open a new place in the last week. I believe he had been working at another cafe in the city, and he was in the process of setting up his own space. So at the time, it was interesting for us because Air had been existing as a wholesale business, and then we'd moved locations to open this retail space. And at the time, there wasn't a lot in Sydney offering, I guess, specialty coffee, cuppings, training, and a big open space for that kind of stuff. And for Dan and I in particular, when we put a prop in at work to say, look, this is what we really want to do as part of this retail space, that was a big part of it, because I think Reuben Hills was opening around about the same time. Mecca was still retail, but they were transitioning to doing their own roasting and all that kind of stuff. So we were hosting weekly cuppings. So that was really fun.
There wasn't anyone else.
It was new for Sydney. There was a lot going on in Melbourne, but not a lot going on in Sydney, and that was really important for us, for our own development, but also to open it up to people. So Toby would come and do the cuppings with us on quite a regular basis before he ended up opening the Wedge.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah,
and the Wedge, like, that's gone crazy as well. It's so funny, like we've been involved in this industry since what feels like it started with regards to this specialty version of what we're doing. And it's crazy to think that all of us were raised in it, in our careers, right? It's just, it's so strange. So when you went from Air then to Senali.
Yeah.
And how did that happen? How did you and Sal meet?
There's two meetings with Sal and I, because the first one I actually don't really remember.
That sounds ominous.
So again, I'm going to say probably 2010 at SCAA in LA. I believe Intelligentsia held a party at Silver Lake, and they were serving a very delicious beer. It was very delicious, and I may or may not have had a couple of pints, maybe, I don't know.
Too many.
I'm a small human, and it doesn't take very much for me to be inebriated. I have a vague recollection of meeting Sal and saying whatever I said.
Oh shit.
And again, you know, after that, it was a passing at a party and having a chat and continuing on with whatever happened that night. And it's funny, there are some photos from that, and Jared Truby and Chris Barker are in the particular. I'll send it to you later as a very particular photo, which is a perfect embodiment of that evening. And Melissa Muckerman and a few others.
Shout out to Melissa.
Yay!
Yeah.
And then a couple of years later, sort of Air went through a bit of a breakdown, I guess. The directors weren't having a great time, and all of us who were working there were, I guess, in a position where we had to reassess our careers. So I then, St. Ali is something that had been in the back of my mind as a company for a while. And I, you know, it's funny, because my friendship with Matt, I had been down every time I went to Melbourne, I would stay with Matt. And I'd been down the year before, funnily enough, for my first interview. Sal picked me up at the airport.
That's sweet.
Yeah, it is sweet. And it's, you know, it's a really important part of the way that he runs St. Ali is in that kind of situation, new interviews or anything else like that. He drove, you know, Tullamarine is sort of 45 minutes. He drove to pick me up from the airport, drove me into town. You know, we had lunch, had the whole conversation and everything else. And that was our first formal interview. But when he picked me up at the airport, he said, and we hadn't met, we talked on the phone, but we hadn't met in person since LA. You know, shook my hand. He said to me, do you remember when we met in LA? And I said, oh, look, vaguely in that sort of dreamlike beer haze. And he said, you had a few interesting things to say to me. And I said, oh, good Lord. And he said, but the important thing is that you spoke your mind, so we're going to be okay.
Okay.
And I still don't know what I said to him.
Oh, shit. I love it. You've got to ask him one day. I've never actually
I'm not
met
sure that
Sal.
it was, you know, I mean, it's nearly 10 years ago. I'm not sure that he'd remember either, to be honest.
Is that how long you've been with St. Ali?
No,
Almost 10 years.
6 years.
6 years, wow.
I'd met him for almost 3 years before I ended up working for him, though. So, yeah, and that was good. And it was sort of one of those things where the vibe of the company, and, you know, I'd had a few friends. So Matt had gone to work for St. Ali the year before. So, you know, he'd started there and he kept, you know, we chat and he goes, when are you going to come work? When are you going to work for us? And I said, oh, you know, I'm, you know, working for Air and you guys are in Melbourne, obviously. I didn't really want to move to Melbourne. No offense, Melbourne, but I really like Sydney.
We're such suckers for our home, aren't we?
Oh, yeah. People say, why did you go to Melbourne? I'm like, I'm really happy.
Once a Sydney girl, always a Sydney girl, sorry.
Nah. You know, sort of in a roundabout, long, convoluted kind of way, it got to a point where sort of Air was in a transitional period, and I'd been there nearly 5 years, and it was sort of the opportunity came up and they said, look, let's just make it happen in Sydney. So it happened, and then 6 months after I started with them, I got offered to be a shareholder in the company. So
yeah, great.
5.5 years ago, and still
so well
strong.
deserved. So well deserved. You and I had a conversation a couple of years ago. About
boys
probably, but that would have been part of the conversation. But we had a conversation about this thing that a lot of people talk about, where it's this intimidation that women experience in the Australian coffee industry, and with the Me Too movement, you and I have had a conversation about how you just never really were affected the same way that most women in coffee have been affected. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, happy to talk about that, I guess. And of course, as always, I can only talk from my own experience, which is really important to acknowledge, because like you and I have talked about in the past, I don't know whether it was, you know, really good luck in the people that I worked with or worked for, or whether, to be honest with you, being, you know, a little older and early on in my career, to be honest with you, probably more tolerant than I should have been to a lot of behaviour around me. I don't have a lot of recollection of really many negative experiences as a woman in the industry, and I know it was sort of a running joke for the first 5 or 8 years of my career that every time I went to a cupping or a meeting or an ASCA meeting or anything else, I was the only female in the room, and the only young female in the room as well. So, I mean, the only really thing that sticks in my mind is that I was told quite early on that in a particular position in a meeting for an opportunity, I was too young to be taken seriously, and I was about 25 at the time.
Yeah, wow.
And my opinion wasn't going to be taken seriously. So that's my only real recollection of experiences for me. Having said that, I think, have a reputation as being quite a forthright and intimidating person from time to time, not necessarily on purpose.
I can't relate at all. I don't know what you're talking about.
Not at all. So I don't know whether that for me has been a little bit of a shield in that I give off a particular vibe. I don't know, but it's, I can only talk to my own experience and not to take away from anyone else's experience. Because having thought about it, I did see other people though have negative experiences. Like I was in a workplace where a young female had been harassed by an older male to a point where she quit her job and sort of went away, and that wasn't managed particularly well at the time. So I did see it for other people, but for me, I guess, I don't know. It's a tough one to talk about, but
yeah,
a lot of it's in hindsight too. And I honestly do think, like, even today, I was probably more tolerant than I should have been. I just didn't know any beter at the time.
When you say you were more tolerant than you should have been, of what kind of behaviour are you talking about?
Oh, probably jokes. Sort of jokes and stabs at the expense of women or minorities or anything like that, where it was socially acceptable to do that kind of stuff.
Yep. Yeah.
So I mean, I can't even look at. I can't think of anything specific, but even today, I don't see it anywhere near as much. But I am in the habit of actually politely calling it out if I see it ever. Yeah. So
I've got to tell you, in this recent tour that we did in Australia, I was pretty shocked. Bless you, Oscar.
Lisa's bless you.
Excuse me. I was really shocked at, and I shouldn't have been, because on a weekly basis I get contacted by women in coffee all around the world telling me their horror stories. But I was shocked at how horrific some of the experiences have been that some of the women in coffee have experienced. I heard stories of women being raped by co-workers. I heard stories of women being sexually assaulted while on business trips. I heard stories of other men that had witnessed things that had happened and told women to just get over it, because this is something that this guy always does and you're not going to be able to fix anything. And I just don't know what to do. I have resolved myself to asking permission if I can confront the abuser myself, not naming these women, because none of them are the only women, the only woman that this has happened to. So the abuser wouldn't have known anything. So now I make it my task to actually confront the person and tell them that I know, and tell them that, and I'll typically make them aware that I have told a certain number of men that know who they are that they have done this. And I mean, I won't do it without having done some research and finding out that this has happened to a couple of other women first, but I just don't know what we can do to bring a stop to it. Is this something that you think we could find a way to get some education around?
I think, it's interesting. So I think it's someone like, so you met Demelza when you were here, who's working on the Same Cup project, who
shout out to Demelza. She's doing some great stuff.
She's a legend, who's actually she's resigned from her full-time job to focus on Same Cup, which is great. And I think situations like that, look, I contemplate this kind of stuff a lot, and I don't know the answers. I don't, every case is an individual. I personally spend a lot of time talking to male colleagues and male friends, and really make a point of trying to, I think, and a lot of the time, to be honest with you, from my experience, a lot of the people I interact with the industry are younger than me, and they have a much higher level of awareness.
Oh yeah,
as a new generation than perhaps the others, and so they are all really without I guess any exceptions, getting quite comfortable at monitoring each other and calling out inappropriate behaviour and stuff like that. So from that point of view, that gives me personally a lot of hope, I guess. I mean, other than I don't know the answer, Lee, and I don't know if I'm necessarily the person to sort of come up and suggest any solutions. But I guess an organisation like Same Cup is a great place to start. So, it's a safe space, I guess, is the best way to describe it.
Yeah.
For people to go, and not necessarily just women, but anybody who feels like they're in a situation where they feel vulnerable or they feel violated. So
we're going to ASCA was going to take a look at sponsoring this, but that's not going to happen anymore. But so we're still going to find a way to make it happen. We're going to try and get assertiveness training for the industry, and have Jamie Berry, who's my favorite person in the world to have conversations about this stuff with. But he's a neuropsychologist, and he does a lot of assertiveness training. So when he came and spoke at the Map It Forward tour in Sydney, we had to extend his talk time by an hour just so that he could just to deal with the questions he was getting from the audience about how to be assertive and how to know where the boundaries are and things like that. There's definitely a need for it. So we're going to try and get assertiveness training for the industry and have that where people can attend via video. And then it lives somewhere where people can get access to the information for free. But I don't know what the answer is. I definitely was challenged. Let's just put that in the nice way. I was never sexually harassed or abused, but I was definitely like men wanted to fight me, physically fight me.
Okay.
Yeah, no, physically fight me because they felt that I didn't know my place as a woman in the workplace. And that's that's harassment. You know, and knowing how to deal with that, like men who do that to women, they're little boys, but that doesn't make it any less frightening for women. You know, when a man bridges up to you at the coffee machine and says, "Bitch, want to take this outside?" We don't know how to deal with that. And when your boss turns around and says, "Well, you guys need to figure this out," you know, we've got to arm employers with the knowledge of how to deal with that kind of situation, because it's not okay that if a man's feeling intimidated by somebody who is his head barista and that makes him feel less than adequate, that's not my fault, dude. I'm the head barista. You need to do what I'm got to tell you to do. I'm managing a queue, you know.
Look, I don't know the answer, but I'm really open, and I'm quite keen to learn. So I've sort of had chats to Jamelza on and off to see what we can do, what I can do personally in my time to assist her in terms of building different things and creating different events. So
I think that
there is positivity in it, I guess, too, though, in terms of people being able to speak out more and find, I guess, peers and people who are out there willing to help as much as they can.
Yeah, look, I'm really hopeful about it, because I think that the darkest times are gone for our industry with regards to that. I think that the Me Too movement has been great for unpacking it and shining a light on it, and I think that it's not going to be tolerated anywhere near as much as it was before, but that doesn't mean it's not going to happen. And people are calling out for the kinds of conversations that need to be had. And what we're recommending is to learn how to start the conversations in your workplace, rather than needing to necessarily have solutions right up front. Just have open conversations about it. We had somebody attend the tour in Sydney who came out and said that the conversation about the Me Too movement was inappropriate in the room that we were in. This was the wrong audience. This is not the right room to have this conversation, because none of the people in this room would ever do that kind of thing to anybody. And I then found out that he was a sexual predator, a known sexual predator in the industry. It's like, what fucking hope do we have? And if a sexual predator is sitting there, I mean, you know, you look at that and you think, well, why didn't other people in the room who knew he was a sexual predator say something? that goes to the heart of the problem is we don't know how to start these conversations or have these conversations openly. And I think that's going to be a big part of the solution moving forward. I do want to ask about ASCA because I know that you have some things to do, and I do want to be very respectful of your time. But you are pretty much the founding member of ASCA, right?
Yes. In a roundabout way. So in my early involvement with World Barista Championship 2001, it was obviously launched in 2000. There was a lot of potential, a lot of interest. So we came back to Australia and said, okay, we need a local body that represents specialty coffee, because there is the Australian Coffee and Tea Association that's very much still exists, but it wasn't necessarily an association that was addressing a lot of the interests and needs of smaller roasters, specialty coffee roasters, baristas, that kind of thing. So we came back and had the inaugural meeting. I was the secretary and gave myself membership number 001.
I think that's so fucking awesome.
Unfortunately, which has subsequently been sort of updated when we transitioned from a
manual system to
pretty much, yeah. I'm showing my age again. The manual system to doing everything online and stuff like that. But I have been involved a lot with ASCA since its initial creation, through a variety of sort of incarnations and everything else, from a sort of a group of 7 people in Donadan Coffee in Mossman in 2001 to what it is now. It's a really healthy national association.
Yeah, wow. Because you left for some time and then came back, right?
I did. So I was quite heavily involved in the first few years, and then it was one of those things where we always said, it'll be a success when we don't need to be doing the admin and the control. If we could get it to we had 2 goals, funnily enough, when we sat, which was get it to a point where there's enough interest that the founding members no longer need to be the admin team, and then also holding a World Barista Championship in Australia. They were the 2 goals that we set. Mm-hmm. And it only took a few years, and we got to a point where the initial team of people stood up to be volunteers, with being secretary, treasurer, president, all that kind of stuff. So that was goal 1. And then eventually, after a couple of attempts, for me personally, which was a long way afterwards, when we had the World Barista Championship and associated events in 2013. So I'd also had a small child, so that was a little bit time consuming.
A little bit, just a little bit.
Yeah, so a little bit.
What did it look like then versus now, with regards to like in between technology and the internet and all of that happened?
Look, it was very analog, if you want to put it that way. So we started the association, and it was really, a lot of it was modeled on SCAA and how incredibly successful they had been in bringing together an industry nationally and sharing education and communication and really breaking down barriers, because it was one of those things, as a youngish industry or an industry transitioning from just sort of roasting coffee and selling it to, we can trace origins and we can talk to farmers and we can do all that kind of stuff, albeit by fax.
I still think it's awesome when I see people on forums here ask for a fax number. I'm like, fuck, people still have faxes?
As a 30-second aside, a girlfriend of mine who is a GP, we were talking about the other day, doctors in Australia still are required, and lawyers, to use fax machines, because it is far more secure than email or online for transmitting particularly sensitive medical results and sensitive law matters. So if you go to a hospital, you'll always find that information will be faxed backwards and forwards between different departments.
So when somebody needs to receive their own medical records by fax and does not have said fax,
you can fax to an electronic version. So
okay,
you can have fax that ends up becoming, if there's an app, I assume. I mean, I have used that in the past, but not for a long time. But
okay,
yeah, interesting.
Something.
I forget what I was talking about now. So what the industry looked like then. So we got, and a lot of it was relying on existing industry. So particularly green brokers were really helpful in spreading the word and growing the network, because I think they were probably in a unique position, and machinery companies, of having access to a whole range of coffee roasters, baristas, cafes. Because they're the ones that really, and still to this day, have the most diverse, I guess, range of customers in the most subjective way. So we relied on a lot of those kinds of people. I remember particularly H.A. Bennett in Melbourne, who's a green coffee company. I mean, they're 150 years old. It's basically one of Australia's first green coffee companies, third or fourth generation family. And those kind of guys. So that's how we really got the word out initially. And then when I stepped out for a few years, it did start to transition and, sort of all the fun stuff like a website and everything transitioned to online and things like that. And then they started to live stream. I remember the very first WBC live stream was from Tokyo in 2007. That was Zachary and Katie, who did the most amazing job. And I don't even remember how they did it, whether they just filmed it and then basically uploaded to YouTube straight away. But it was the first time.
Yeah,
and it was one of those things where it just allowed such a huge audience and everything's a little snowballed from there. So,
over the 20 years or whatnot that we've been in the industry, you were telling me before how you used to get in contact with coffee farmers. Tell that story. That blew my mind.
So, I was talking earlier, the very first job we had, the generic single origins on the back wall. And it was just, we were starting to do coffee education, barista training. Even when I started as a barista, I had no clue that coffee was a cherry that grew on a tree. So when we started to learn all that kind of stuff and then share the information, naturally I think you want to learn more about where the coffee comes from and, why the coffee from Mexico tastes different to the coffee from Colombia or why that coffee tastes different to whatever else we had. So if and when we asked for information or we wanted to get more information on a particular coffee, it would kind of go along the lines of the roaster would ring the broker because there wasn't really a lot of direct trade. Wasn't really a possibility. It was still just starting to evolve out of the US, and then obviously would spread Australia a lot further from origin than any of those countries. You'd ring the broker and you'd say, we'd really like more information about this particular coffee. And he'd go, yeah, no worries. So he would pretty much, write up the fax that across to said country. Whoever worked in the office in that country would often either then sort of, take it down the road to the local mill, who would then often probably, walk up the hill or take the Jeep up the hill to that particular farmer, get that information, have that conversation, and it would come back, get back on the fax machine, be faxed back to Australia.
Wow.
And then we'd get the information. So that was it was fun. So it was more of a 2-week process as opposed to now when I can basically...
you can
FaceTime or WhatsApp the farmer, have a chat, text,
Instagram, call them. Yeah,
exactly. So it's, I'll say it time and time again when people ask me is that the internet has been absolutely integral in connecting people and growing the associations and growing the whole industry and getting people to understand a lot more, because a lot of the time prior to that, you had stories of origin which were, horribly colonial and patronising and everything else. And, when it was first introduced to me, it was like, we're going to go to origin and save the farmers and teach them how to do it properly. And I just thought, I know. That's really niggled at me from early on. So having, been to SCAA in 2001 in Miami and meeting, that was still an epiphany as well. You're sort of having, this is another whole story, having flown into Orlando and had to catch a Greyhound bus from Orlando to Miami and actually surviving that at 3 o'clock in the morning. Traumatic, changed the way I travel forever. And then going to walk, I still remember walking into the conference on the first day and there were tens of thousands of people there, it felt like anyway, who all had the same interest and passion in coffee in general. And, and then suddenly I met farmers from, and I still remember, people at the time coming down the escalator and, farmers and Americans and Spanish having this amazing conversation going, gosh, I really want to understand what they're talking about. But then having met, meeting different farmers and understanding where they come from and making really, really good friends with people from countries I would never have imagined. Again, I've gone off on a tangent.
It's quite humbling though, isn't it? It's quite humbling.
It was really humbling, but it was really reassuring as well, because I think until that point I was really enjoying working with coffee and understanding, but I sort of got to a point where I'm working in the store and I'm making coffee and I'm teaching people, but, sort of what's next? Where can I, to be honest with you, map my career if I'm going to, not become a politician.
I still think that's amazing that you thought that was going to happen.
It may still happen. Watch this space. You never know.
Oh, I can't wait to have that conversation.
Oh, it'll be, I'm never going to say never. But it was really humbling, but incredibly reassuring, because suddenly I thought, okay, all these people share this passion in this product, in this industry. And now I sort of seen the entire supply chain and understand the people that grow the coffee and the people that export the coffee and the people that roast the coffee, and then this. Oh, there's a whole world that I can be involved with here. This is great. So that really was a moment for me when I went, oh, maybe I could do this as a career, because I really enjoy it. Yeah.
I'm still being mind blown by our supply chain. I feel like, how did I go this long without understanding the back end of the supply chain with as much depth as I've had the absolute honor of understanding because of this podcast? Like the people who come on my podcast and tell me about this stuff. I'm going to Oaxaca, hopefully in February, to do a podcast on a coffee farm as a follow-up of an earlier podcast episode that we did, to talk about some of the challenges they're having with regards to having a mill and doing all this kind of stuff. And I thought, how did I go most of my career not understanding this side of things? It's I don't know. I think it's because of the barrier to entry for our industry is so low that we don't really have like a degree to get into coffee and there are college courses or like TAFE courses and things that can prepare you for that in Australia. But nothing that's as comprehensive as exactly what we need in order to do this kind of thing. And I hope that we change that. I really hope that we get people and give them insight into that stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting, because I think that makes me think back to ASK. And I know one of the biggest challenges we had early on in kind of all that kind of stuff is, even as an industry, trying to agree on a definition of any of those
specialty coffee.
Well, not even specialty
direct
coffee,
trade,
but even a definition of what is acceptable level of barista skills, or what is an acceptable qualification to do a particular job. And it did get to a point where, ASCA still wants to, talk about providing education, particularly because I know for SCA that's been incredibly successful. And I have taught SCA classes in the past, so I've been down that path. But there is, it's almost at a point where the Australian industry was or is so advanced that everyone sort of has their own little aspects of how they want to train and teach and what they value. It's almost not, it never is, but it's almost too late to then even have a base definition of what do you need to be a barista at this level, and what's actually, it's actually incredibly difficult. So, and I think that's one of those challenges for any sort of formalized qualification. And I think it's, again, why Q grading is so incredibly popular. I know it has been here in particular. So we finally have, or close to having, Q instructors certified in Australia. Because in the past, when we've run courses here, which is fine, they are expensive to run, and that is what it is. It's the cost of that. But in addition to that, you have an instructor in Australia and they need to be here for a couple of weeks, and you obviously need to pay them for their time and stuff. So that makes it's really difficult to access a lot of education because it is just incredibly expensive.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, it's an interesting thing even to do all of that. But I think it's, look, I don't know, and maybe it is just another level of education, but a lot of people, maybe until recently, look, they don't even really understand where their food comes from, let alone their coffee. So
yeah, you're right.
And I think it's all in that same kind of aspect. And it's really fascinating for me. Again, off topic, my sister is married to a farmer and they live and work on the land. They're right in the middle of New South Wales. And, even the first time, she's been out there 15 years, but even the first time that I visited, we were sort of doing a tour and they're growing wheat and they have cotton and all this kind of stuff. As a 30-something, I had a million questions on what actually happened in the supply chain, because he's growing wheat on a farm, but how does that actually get to a loaf of bread or to, something else? So there is a real disconnect, I think, for people on understanding where all of those products come from, let alone where coffee comes from. So
how do you think we as an industry can get more people in the general public, not working in coffee, but in the general public, understanding the importance of this coffee supply chain?
Good question.
I think we're all asking ourselves that. I think
it's interesting because I think back to, so the barista competitions in WBC, and that really was when it launched out of Scandinavia in the late 90s, and even as WBC, that was really about bringing the barista to the forefront and having an event that showcased the skill that's involved in making coffee, which in most countries in the world was huge. In Australia, it was like, yeah, I got 3 baristas down the road, kind of thing. So it's one of the things I don't know, and I have thought about it. It's conversations, but maybe it is those shops where this is why this coffee is worth $18, because you get to a point where the people come in, they have a really positive experience. They have a delicious cappuccino with 1 sugar. And they go, that was really delicious. And they go, okay, well, next time, if you're interested, you can try something else. It is a long-term relationship that you can perhaps build up if you do it the right way. And I think it's having an impact. I think, you get to a point where people are starting to pay attention and ask where things come from. And I think, there's a greater diversity. There's been some really interesting events, and I know Ollie touched on it in the last podcast, where we had World Coffee Research in Australia a couple of months ago, with single origin roasters, and they gave a series of presentations just about the research that they're doing and how they're trying to fund it and new species of coffee they're trying to grow. The best part of that, I think, is that we got all your mainstream media and all your mainstream food media were there, did the interviews, and, you got to write up in, Delicious, Gourmet Traveller, Herald, all that kind of stuff. So there was, just a little bit, and then people will read that article and
yep.
I mean, I don't know how else to do it, to be honest with you. Like, media is still going to be the way to tap into mainstream interest. And then there was a few articles, and I guess it's maybe a little bit of scaremongering, because it's been interesting in what Ollie said last week or the week before, that there's a lot of scaremongering about climate change and running out of coffee and stuff like that. But that caught a lot of people's attention, so they were actually paying attention. And I still, when I talk to groups or I do a presentation or we do an education for the general public, people are still astounded that it's a fruit of a tree. So even to that level, people don't know that that's where the coffee comes from.
Yeah. I mean, I hope that it's something that going into the future, a whole bunch of us can come together and strategize about how do we get this understanding of some of the great stuff and some of the not so great stuff that's happening with the coffee supply chain out to the general public. Because I think it's a really important conversation that they need to be having with regards to their buying practices. I want them to understand that what it means to a coffee supply chain when they choose to buy X brand of instant coffee, that the farmers have been paid under what it costs to actually produce a crop. That's not a sustainable practice. And full disclosure, I didn't understand anything about this before this podcast started.
Yeah.
And I accidentally started learning about it. And so if us in the industry don't know about it, what fucking hope do we have of the general public understanding it if we don't understand it first?
It's incredibly complex, though, and there's a variety of different ways to do it. So
yeah.
I think it's important that, a lot of the time in an industry, like specialty coffee in particular, it's quite a small industry, and we all talk to each other about stuff and we all agree and we're all very excited about it. But I think that sometimes we need to turn that outwards and start talking to other people about it, but not in a, you've got to buy this and that. It's like, well, are you interested in where it comes from, or do you understand where it comes from? So a lot of the time when I speak to people who don't work in the coffee industry and ask me what I do, the running joke is I drink coffee for a living. They sort of look at me and go, that's usually the response. And so the questions usually are, what's your favorite coffee? Where does it come from? And have you drunk that cat shit coffee? Because it's always the second question
I get the fox coffee. Have you had the fox shit coffee?
What are those animals that shit the coffee? And that's the second. It's always those questions. And they'll often say, what do you think of Starbucks? And then, so that usually gives an opportunity, not for me obviously to be preachy, because I never want to be that person, but to talk a little bit about what we do, I guess, as a company, and what I've always wanted to do since I started in coffee, as opposed to just selling. And I say, look, we just want to be conscious of the whole supply chain and making sure everyone along that way gets looked after. We're all running a business. We're all in a position where we need to make money to live, but we're also entitled to do it as part of what we do. We just want to make sure that no one gets screwed along the way, and that we pay respect to all of those elements. So, whether we buy coffee absolutely direct and then use a third party as a broker, as a transport company, or whether we work through a broker on the ground who we know is going to do the right thing ethically or whatever else, I'm not sure that it matters as much as people like to make it, make it.
I'm with you
as long as you're
I mean, does it really matter who moves the coffee as long as everybody in the supply chain is taken care of and nobody's treated
absolutely.
like shit?
I think so, and I think that's a really realistic way of looking at it. And it's kind of the same attitude I think I take to, what do you think of the coffee in this particular cafe? I'm like, well, they're creating a product that people enjoy. They're doing it with, you know, I guess, respect to everyone in the supply chain, and their customers are enjoying it.
Tick, 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 tick.
Exactly. So,
I mean, everyone sleeps well at night when something like that.
Exactly.
And that's what we're doing. That's what we want to all achieve, peace of mind.
Yeah.
What a great spot to end the podcast. I know you've got to rush to the Apple store. So, hey.
Again, twice in a week. We'll see how that goes.
Good luck. Happy holidays. Wishing you and your family such a
Lovely
great end to the year. It's always too long between our conversations, but
we're going to try and come and visit on stage.
Oh, I can't wait.
No, when.
Yes, please come to San Diego. Come stay with me.
Do you like basketball? Because we'll be attending a lot of basketball games.
Excellent. Well, you'll need to be in LA for that because San Diego has 0.
Okay, fair enough.
We have baseball, and I think we're about to acquire a soccer team.
Okay,
maybe.
Cool.
I don't know.
Okay.
I've got my head in a laptop and in a kitchen making elixir all the time, so I don't get much time to do that kind of social stuff.
Excellent.
One day. Have an amazing rest of your year and all the best for 2019, lady. You deserve nothing but great things coming your way.
Oh, you're very kind. Thank you, Lee.
Have a lovely, lovely rest of your day.
Bye.
Bye.